Thank you so much. It is always a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I think one of the things that I was struck by in Scott Massey's remarks and his wonderful closing was that, of course, this summit is, in a sense, a fulfillment of that vision of Anatole France, that it is a dream, it is a plan, but it is also an executed and actionable set of agenda items. And for that, I think we have to thank Scott for his vision, for his leadership, but also for making these things happen. It's very unusual to have something this ambitious that involves so many stakeholders come together in the way that he's been able to do it. I think that all of us can see in this summit itself a small glimpse of what is possible if you have good leadership, if you have a vision, but also then if you somehow sustain and implement it. So Scott, thank you. Look, I thought I'd start by just talking a little bit about not the events in Paris, because you know about them, but why they happened and how it relates to what we're doing here. People are always puzzled and horrified and bewildered by the kind of violence they're seeing now. And I think it is entirely appropriate to be puzzled and horrified and bewildered by it. Because in a way, what we're trying to figure out is something very, very unusual, which is the ability to believe in a kind of ideology, to believe in a worldview that is so motivating to you that you are able to do great harm to other people, that you are able to inflict enormous pain on other people because you have convinced yourself that this is actually the right thing to do. In a sense, the most dramatic version of this, the most dramatic manifestation of this, is that what you see in these terrorists in Paris and elsewhere is not just the willingness to kill. That, unfortunately, is fairly common in human societies, and you see it in every country. Certainly we see it a great deal in the United States. It is not simply the willingness to kill, but the willingness to die that is, that cries out for some larger explanation, and that cries out for an explanation about what is going on in these parts of the world that seem to be producing this ideology, this anger, this kind of worldview. And in order to understand that, I think, there are people, of course, who have gone back and said, well, it's all about Islam. It's all about the religion. And the problem with that, of course, is the religion has been around for 14 centuries. There have been many, many centuries of peace and some periods of war. When I was in graduate school getting my PhD, I was taught you can't explain something that's varying with something that's constant. In other words, if it's Islam, you should have had 14 centuries of uninterrupted war since it's been around for 14 centuries. But what explains the fact that sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't? What explains the fact that in the last 30 years you have had this particular upsurge of radicalism, violence, and jihad? You can look in the Quran and you can certainly find some verses that are nasty and violent, and you can find verses in there that are beautiful and uplifting and peaceful, as you can, by the way, in the Bible. Religion is a big grab bag. You can usually find in it what you want. And then, of course, there is this further puzzle, which is, for the most part, these fires are emanating out of a particular part of the world. Most people don't realize that the largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, which has just elected a businessman, pro-Western, pro-trade, pro-development president who is busily trying to reform that country. The second largest Muslim population in the world by most counts is in India. Again, a country that is democratic, prosperous, or prospering, and in which there are mostly focus on development and growth and the kinds of things that you like to talk about, we like to talk about. It's only when you get to number 4 or 5, by the way, that you get to the fires that we are talking about, which are in the Arab world. Most of this phenomenon that we are discussing is in its origins a Middle Eastern phenomenon. And why is that? Well, permit me to give you a small historical, a sense of the history, and then move on, because you really have to understand the history to understand how this happened. If you look back in the 1950s, when countries in the Middle East were first becoming independent from European colonial empires, and you would have said, what part of the world is going to modernize, is going to be developed, is going to be in some way happily coexisting in the modern world? The Middle East or Asia? Everyone would have said the Middle East. Why? Because the Middle East was already pretty modern. It had these great centers of culture and civilization like Damascus and Beirut and Baghdad and Alexandria and Egypt. These were places that had been great trading centers, parts of the Ottoman Empire that had been exposed to the currents of modernity. They were also very mixed in population terms. Baghdad in 1920 was a quarter Jewish. And even in the 1950s, you had very large parts of the Middle East, particularly the urban centers, that had centuries of coexistence among Christians and Jews and Muslims and Armenians and Turks and Kurds. And that reality was very much manifest in terms of the outward orientation of many of these countries. If you looked at Asia, by the way, in comparison, you looked at Seoul and Taiwan and Manila, these were backwaters. No one would have regarded them as places that were going to be at the forefront of modernity. And then you begin to see the process of development take place. And initially, it seems to be going at least, it seems to be going well, or at least it seems to be going energetically. So you look at a man like Nasser, the president of Egypt, who was in many ways considered the great hero of the Arab world. He was a modernizer, he was westernized, he wore suits, he read Le Monde. His advisors tended to come from places like the London School of Economics and the University of California at Berkeley. And they were advising in those days a kind of state planning and socialism that we now know doesn't work so well, but that was the best Western advice at the time. And that was, in a way, the impetus of all these places that were coming out of their colonial